Welcome to Practical Talk Time. I'm your host Usha Kumar. I have here with me a very noted writer, gardener, and a very popular lecturer, and that is Sydney Eddison. She is a resident of the Greater Danbury area in Connecticut, and she has won so many awards for her garden and her contribution to gardening. In 2002, she received the Connecticut Horticultural Society's Gustav Malmquist Award. In 2005, she received the New England Wildflower Society's Catherine Taylor Award. Later, in 2006, she received the Federated Garden Club of Connecticut's Bronze Medal. And now this year, she has won the very prestigious National Garden Club's Award of Excellence. And she's the author of 8 garden books, and she is now working on her next one, and I'm so honored to welcome you. Sydney Eddison, welcome you to the show.
Thank you so much, Usha. I've been looking forward to it.
I recently visited your garden, and it was such a pleasure. It was such a feast just to look at all the flowers in summer. And I know that you've been gardening for about almost 50 years now.
Yes,
So
I know, it seems amazing.
could you tell us a little bit about your experience, getting into gardening and how you progressed from there?
Well, the thing is that I think everybody should know who sees my garden now. They really should know I didn't know anything at all, nothing, except that I like playing outside. My husband and I had been looking for an old house and privacy. And my goodness, we found it in spades, and we live in the middle of a state forest. And I looked around me, and I loved the house right away. It's a wonderful old yellow house then. And the woods all around, and as I grew up in Connecticut, I loved the woods anyway. It really did seem my natural habitat. And but I looked around and I thought, gosh, there's an awful lot of stuff all growing right up to the back door, tall weeds and prickly things. And I thought really we ought to get out there and whack some of that down. And I mean, that was literally the only thought in my mind, was just to make it look better. And so I got out there and whacked. I got big shears, and I thought, my goodness, this is going to take a long time. And my husband saw that I was absolutely determined to push back the brush, and so he got a Gravely tractor. And together, over a period of, actually it took really about 20 years to clear the area where the garden is now and the field beyond. And so that's how it began. It was for fun. I had a full-time job. I was teaching theater at a couple of different schools in Connecticut, private schools. And I was working for 9 months of the year, but the joy of teaching, one of them, is that you have the summer free, and you can do quite a lot of digging and planting in that 3 months. So that's really how it began. But I mean, my life included a lot of other things as well. I mean, my teaching job, and I worked many, many weekends. And my husband was working, and we had tons of English visitors. My husband was from England. My mother was English, and I had cousins come and visit. So there was a lot going on. So it was by no means just gardening. And I sincerely did not know anything, except that I loved the exercise of digging, and my most satisfying moments were prying up great big rocks with a crowbar. My husband said I was the only woman he ever knew who bent a crowbar. So it really, it didn't begin, I didn't have some plan. I didn't think I was going to become a gardener, and I never dreamed how much my life would in the end involve gardening. And believe me, there's nothing, the one thing about my garden that I do like when people come to see it is that they look at it now almost 50 years later, and of course they say, oh gosh, I could never do that. Yes, you could. It takes 50 years, but of course you could do it. Anybody could do it. I had no experience, I had no training, I had terrific amount of energy, and I loved wildflowers, and I did know local trees and flowers. That I did. But that was absolutely all. And it just shows what, well, it's like in Chorus Line, the gal who says, I did it for love. And that is why you garden. And eventually you can make, I mean, I've seen beautiful private gardens made by amateur gardeners like myself. And it really has been kind of my mission in life to encourage, that is something I really do want to do, is encourage anybody with an interest to give it a whirl. You know, don't be daunted. Don't worry about what somebody else thinks. It's your garden.
Yeah, there's another English gardener like yourself who's also written books, and that's Alan Titchmarsh. And I'm just paraphrasing what he said, that you know, people who've been allowed to do what they want to do most, you know, they are really very lucky. And also, you know, the ability to do what you want to do, and you have the passion for it. And you've been doing that all your life.
Yes, actually.
Basically.
And believe me, I feel very lucky. And then to have something at last to write about, because that's something that I wanted to do from the time I was 8. But I agree absolutely with that quote you read me, which really was beautiful, and that you are incredibly lucky if you can find something that you really love to do and then have the freedom to do it. And my husband was absolutely go for whatever I wanted to do. But that did not mean he wanted to garden, because he did not personally wish to dig holes. It just wasn't his idea of a good time, but it was mine. So,
and especially the end result that you envision. I mean, you're willing to do all the hard work just to see the flowers bloom.
I honestly was willing to do the hard work because I liked the hard work.
So the hard work itself?
Yeah, I really did. And I loved clearing, because there's something that is madly satisfying about looking at something that was absolutely chaotic and making order of it by clearing it. And a garden is about making order. And I truly think, yes, I adored flowers and wanted to have flowers. But actually that craze that lasted a relatively short time, considering, and in that 50 years, I don't think more than, well, maybe for 10 years I was obsessed with flowers, but the foliage is so much more important in the end because it lasts longer, or at least it should do. And it is the plants and the forms in a garden. And what I love best about my garden, and where I really think it has been the most successful, is where I have sort of held down the pattern of the garden with, you know, the solid conical forms of trees like Alberta spruces and arborvitae, and rounded forms which seem to have a weight to them. And it's about forms and shapes and pattern and space. And so that gardening is so much more than just flowers. And I think that is the fascinating thing, that goes on, being more and more interesting. And at each stage, and gardeners definitely go through phases and stages. And of course there are also crazes. I mean, I've seen more hot plants come and go in the last 20 years than you can shake a stick at. At one point, a little tiny petunia called Petunia integrifolia literally swept the gardening community. I mean, everybody had these little petunias tumbling out of jars.
And everyone had to have one.
Oh yeah, everybody had to have one. And then now you have trouble finding them. They've got million bells, which is a better plant. Then it was a verbena, a tall, skinny verbena with a little tuft of flowers, and that was a craze for a while. And now it's, well, then we actually, even coleus is tapering off now, but that was the, oh wow plant for a good many years. So it's kind of fun. Gardening is ever new and always old.
I know I read some of your books, and they are full of all these various flowers. Some of them, I had to look up the dictionary and look up all the other Wikipedia, whatever else I could find to know more about those plants, because you do mention so many varieties that I've never heard of before. And
I actually, now, I grow very straightforward plants. I imagine you would recognize 98% of the flowers in my garden, and possibly 98% of the plants. Maybe you'd be a little shaky on some of the shade plants, because I've tried some experimental things.
in your initial garden, were you inspired by the English gardens?
Oh, yes. I was inspired by going to visit my grandmother, who's, my mother's English. And my grandmother had a charming garden, gardened by my aunt. And my mother's three sisters, although my mother didn't garden, but her three sisters were all great gardeners. And yes, very much so. I absolutely fell in love with the sort of tumbling masses of phlox and roses and delphiniums and all the things that I discovered very quickly when I had a garden of my own to make. I put all those things in the garden, and I got rid of them all because those plants don't like it much here, and they're very high maintenance.
But I thought they did use a lot of perennials.
Oh yeah, they do. I mean, many more than here. I mean, there's still the craze for perennials as a popular fad really ran its course during the mid to late 80s and the 90s. And then when money began to be tighter, then people who didn't garden but had gardens and wanted to have gardens became fewer, and then the perennial craze sort of faded a lot. But people who really love gardening still have perennial borders that they're slaving away over, and they're trying new things and putting in new plants all the time. And I mean, that's the fun of it. And I did it for as long as I could.
Your initial garden was more a summer garden when you first started
Yes,
out, because of
I was
your
teaching.
free time and summer.
Yeah, it was only summer, and therefore I had the same ideas that an awful lot of other people do, that it all had to be flowers, and that by the time I had learned enough about when plants bloom to have the whole thing in bloom in the summer, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. But actually it was much less interesting garden than when I thought, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this picture, which is A&1, the garden by August was practically defunct because it weighed so heavily upon
with spent flowers and
it was
dying
like the
plants.
daylilies, which are done by the end of July, and I had a ton of daylilies, and I still have a ton of daylilies.
Then you proceeded to plant in other seasons, things that would bloom or look good in spring and fall.
Yes. Sorry to interrupt you, because I know what you mean, because that was you're absolutely right. I had a summer garden, and when I say summer, it was really from the mid-June till the end of July, and then it kind of ran out of steam, and me too. And then, of course, because I was teaching, I went back to work early, and so then teaching really took over my life. And in those days, even just before I retired from teaching, I had done the whole long border, which is 100 feet long, but I had not made it as wide as it ultimately became. And I could single-handedly, over the Thanksgiving weekend, I could put the whole thing to bed. Don't forget, I was
That's a
run
lot of
like
work.
an ox.
It's a lot of work.
A lot of, sure is
I
a
don't
lot of
think
work.
I'll ever attempt that. In your plantings, you use a lot of color, and then you combine the colors very beautifully.
Thank you.
And also you let them bloom kind of in a cycle, like one finishes blooming and the next thing starts to bloom, and then the next thing.
That is a very tricky maneuver. And yes, after really about 20 years, I got the hang of it. And indeed, the garden was in bloom very much longer. There was an early season sort of period of bloom with peonies, Siberian iris, a few bearded irises, some, let me see what else there was. Well, oh yes, and of course all these rhododendrons that I began planting, the very first thing I planted, because I had so fallen in love with them, and a wonderful sort of vast country garden that I'd seen in England that was, I had no idea at the time, it was designed by Capability Brown, so, his son. So, but it was no wonder I thought it was a pretty nice garden. And some of those plants were, well over 100 years old. So I thought, oh, wow, this has got to be the most beautiful place I've ever seen. And it was the rhododendrons, these oceans of bloom. And I have my own little mini Sheringham bower now. It's, because these things are 50 years old, the stuff that I planted. So it's pretty impressive in the spring. So there's the rhododendrons, and then fronting that, the irises and the peonies. Then there's a pause, and it's just green until the daylilies begin to bloom. Okay. And then it really is a riot of, I think, rather craftily.
When is it green? Around June, early June?
About the last week in June to the end of June is the green stage.
The green stage.
Which I now, honestly, I love as much as I love all that color. So there you are.
There is a favorite quote of yours that I want to say, You said, gardens are a form of autobiography. And I think you wrote that in one of your earlier books.
Yeah, that was in the first book, because I realized that in making the garden, because the first book was about making the garden, and it is about making it out of complete ignorance, and then some of the really idiotic things that I did, and that my husband and I also did, like putting in a dreadful swimming pool. It makes me shudder now, but it is autobiographical. It speaks to me of my English roots. It speaks to me of my childhood of playing in the woods, of even the things that even of the literature I liked. I mean, I dreamed when I was in my teens of being Rima in Green Mansions, W.H. Hudson's Green Mansion. She was a sort of tree sprite. And so, yes, it is. A garden tells the story of the person who creates it. And I do believe that, and I see it in I see it in the gardens of my friends. Yeah. Very much so.
Yeah, your garden is so beautiful. Like, it just cannot, unless people go and actually see it and look at the extensive shade garden that you have there. I mean, it's very hard to describe in words, and they should sometime, I think, take the time to come and see it.
Well, it would be a pleasure. I try to open the garden once a year, but it is getting more difficult to do that because we're in the process of simplifying it and making some really important changes.
Yeah, I know that over time your health has not permitted you to be as active as you were in gardening, in the sense going and actually digging the holes.
Yes, I did literally dig every hole, every shrub, and some of the trees that are now whacking great trees. Yeah, I dug those holes, but
Now it's become
the
harder
holes
for
could
you.
be smaller, you
Yeah,
see,
yeah.
because the plants were smaller. Until last year, I could still work for, I could work for 4
Yeah,
or
lugging
5
the
hours.
mulch.
And lugging stuff, yeah,
Lugging
because
stuff,
a very
making-
sweet girl who helped me, she said, gosh, there's an awful lot of physical work here. And I said, yeah, that's why I need you.
Yeah.
Because it's a very physical activity, the way I garden is anyway. And I was doing fine until my hip went, and then last summer I really could do very little.
So that's when you kind of settled for the simpler way of gardening.
Yes,
Right?
I had to.
Well, I think we wanted to bring up a picture.
Oh, yeah, I
Yeah,
would like
that's-
to, very much.
What is that? Could you tell the audience?
Yes, I could. I very much wanted you to see some of the audience to see some of the illustrations from the book, because they were done by a great friend who's a wonderful graphic artist, and I felt very much that her drawings particularly, because she is a wonderful plants woman. Her name is Kimberly Day Proctor, and she's a wonderful plants woman. She grew up at Oliver Nursery in Fairfield, and she knows her plants, and she also graduated from Rhode Island School of Design and is a wonderful artist. And I love that. That is the gate up into the field. And it's an old style that we found and uncovered when Martin and I were clearing the land, and we built a couple of extra steps, and I love that. I feel it's an invitation.
We are running out of time. I think we ran out of time, right? So for those of you who want to know more about gardening, we didn't run out of time. We have some time, all right. I wanted to find out about giving some tips to gardeners, if you have.
Well, it depends on what stage you are at in your gardening career. How useful the tips that I'm going to give are. I think they're pertinent to pretty much any gardener who is either working, has a family, and has not got as much time as they would like. And I think that's the lot of almost every person I know. And one of the things that you can do that makes it a lot easier right away is to not take out all your plants that take a little time and fiddling with, but to limit the number of plants that have one of these qualities. One, are extremely, let's put it the nicest possible way, enthusiastic growers. Plants that spread very quickly, like bee balm, which is lovely, and it attracts butterflies and hummingbirds and the whole 9 yards, but it is an absolute monster. It takes off, and pretty soon it's all over its neighbors. So it seems to me that is a plant that you don't want to have to be whacking back all the time, and if you have great masses of it and it gets loose, you might want to reduce those masses. I had great masses of daylilies, so when I wanted to begin to simplify a little bit and save myself some time, I found new homes for some of the daylilies. So grape spreaders are one class of plants. Daylilies have another quality, and that is to really look pretty. They need the dead, sloppy heads, and each flower only lasts a day. Those have to be cleared away. So that's deadheading. So don't have too many of those. Don't have too many plants that are very tall and constantly flop over. Do not have plants that are absolutely deer magnets unless you have a deer fence. Do not have plants that are absolutely a magnet for disease, such as garden phlox, which is perfectly beautiful, but half the time it looks as if it was a gray foliage plant. You don't want it to have gray foliage from mildew. You want it to be green. And only one of the few phlox that I ever grew was a white one called David. and that did not get terrible mildew, and there are others now. But so one of the really practical tips is don't have too many of the things that take the most time.
I think
So,
I made all
there
those
you are.
mistakes in my garden
Well,
over
how
the
do you
20
think
years.
I know not to do this? The only way I knew was by doing it all.
Yeah, I wish I could have saved all my trouble, if I'd read your book first.
Well, I don't know. If you've had fun doing it, that's
Oh,
all.
yes, I did.
Then I think it's fine.
At one time, I got so scared of gardening that I just let the junipers thrive and left my yard be all lawn and junipers and arborvitae. It was all green.
Well, an all-green garden is very peaceful, but it isn't, to me, as much fun as fooling around with a lot of other things and then finding out what you can and can't, what you do and do not think is worth your time. And I do think that you've got to make those decisions, because I don't know anybody who's got enough time, nowadays especially.
Yeah. I think in your earlier books you had mentioned that you need to take your time, know what you're doing, especially preparing the bed is so important.
Yes,
people just
it
go
is.
dig a hole and plant the way I did, instead of preparing, get the soil, getting it ready to take
It's a
a plant.
great way to start, is digging a hole, and I'm all for it, because I certainly didn't do a thing for the plants at first. I mean, when I planted the first dahlias, I stuck them in a hole, threw in some peat moss, and that was it. But I learned over a period of time that the best gardens are the gardens that grow in the best soil, and that's.
Yeah, I also know that you, in your effort in gardening, you also included your friends. You have a lot of gardening friends that come and work with you, and then you compare notes, exchange ideas, right? And even plants.
Is wonderful like that. In the first place, when I was learning, so many people, gardeners who had experience and were way ahead of me, light years ahead of me, were enormously kind, and they gave me plants, they gave me tips, and I think that everybody's garden really is a patchwork garden. But that's why I wrote A Patchwork Garden, was partly as a tribute to the friends who had contributed so much to my garden.
Thank you so much. I think our time is up. Thank you very much for joining us today on this segment of Making a Gardener. For those of you at home, thank you all for watching the Practical Talk Time. And for those who want to know more about gardening, you should watch our segment, Gardening for a Lifetime. That'll be coming up later. And until next time, goodbye.